So this here is about upgrading the web application to app services. We are going to actually physically move the application from your premise into Azure and into app services. And again, a quick reminder, there are a few reasons why people are migrating to the cloud. And we talked about that more in detail in the first session, so I'm not going back into every one of those points. But I want to mention specifically for web application, the application innovation that you can bring to your application into Azure is really fantastic. You can easily leave your web server untouched so that it runs perfectly fine, but then you add around it some services, for example, using serverless applications, using cognitive services for artificial intelligence and to add new things into your app. Or maybe you want to have a mobile backend, for example, so that you have a mobile companion for your web application, which again runs completely untouched. So this is really a good set of reasons to move into the cloud. And again, if we remember the migration journey, the 4 stages that I talked about in the first session, we are going now from assessment into the migration itself. Couple of recommendations that I want you to remember. Do the assessment first because this is your peace of mind, and also don't start with your most critical workload. So Azure Migrate, right, this is a hub. We already saw that in the first module earlier on. We are going to see it more in this session as well. So without further ado, let's go to migrating the web application. And again, I want to quickly remind you what application we are going to migrate. So this is an old ASP.NET 3.5 application. And it is running web forms, which is a very popular solution, but which is maybe a little bit obsolete. And we already talked about possibilities that you have to migrate to .NET Core, but we are not there yet now. First of all, we really want to move this to Azure. .NET 3.5, let's open here a page. You see that we have a lot of web forms content, web forms controls and everything. This is the application that we are going to migrate. You see that it is a rewards management application where you can manage orders for customers as well as coupons and rewards. And so when we went to Tailwind Traders and when we checked the application, one thing we noticed is that they have the SQL connection string saved in web config. Now, it's not really surprising because it was a very popular way to do things, but there are a few issues with that. For example, one issue is that this is probably going to end up in source control at some point, and you really don't want that because those are your secrets. So one thing we can do, we are going to modify that. Let's go to the data access handler. And here, this is where I get the connection string from the web config. But instead, I'm going to modify the code a little bit to allow me to retrieve the connection string from environment variables instead. And I have a fallback to the web config if I don't find things in environment variables. But like this is going to give me more flexibility, and it's going also to make it super easy to have different connection string depending on the environment. So now I can go back into the web config, I can remove the connection string. I probably want to purge GitHub from that file, from that string at least, so that nobody can find it. So now we are ready to do the migration in a better way, in a more secure way, and we'll understand a little bit later how we can save the connection string in an even more secure way. So here we go back to the Azure App Service Migration Assistant. This is where we stopped the previous demo because we have done the assessment and now we are ready for the migration itself. So we are going to select the subscription, the resource group. We still use the same rewards resource group. And then we select a name. Now this name needs to be unique worldwide because of course it's going to be a domain name. But notice that it is a working name only. And later we are going to configure also custom domain. We are going to select a region. Again, I'm based in Switzerland. I select here Western Europe, which is close to my users. And then we need to create or select an app service plan. In that case, I'm going to create a new one. App service plan is essentially defining how many resources you're going to have, how powerful your web server is going to be. It defines things like, for example, features that you have, if you want slots, etc. Here we are going to go with the default proposed app service plan. Now, one thing also we need to select is the database setup. And here we can skip it because my database actually has a public IP address. It has a public port open. So I can connect to it using the connection string in a hybrid manner. But if my database was private, I can set up hybrid connection, and that's going to allow you to establish a private connection to your database using the hybrid connection tool. All right, let's start the migration. In reality, it takes a few minutes, all right? So we are just going to wait a moment, and we will see eventually what happens and if the migration was successful. All right, seems that everything worked fine. This is great. So we can go and see what we did, and then we can start configuring the web application. But at this point, it seems to be already running in Azure, which is a good success. That's great. So let's go back to the resource group. I'm going to refresh and see what was created. We see the web application itself, the app service, as well as the app service plan. This is where you can manage all that. Let's go into the portal, into the app service. We are going to go to the configuration, because right now if you try to run it, you're going to have an error because the connection string is not in web config anymore. You need to set it up. So let's go here in the setting. I'm going to add the connection string, and then I just paste the connection string in clear text, which is, it's more secure than in the web config. It's not in GitHub, but at the same time, it means that every one of my developers will have access to that, and that can be maybe a little bit disturbing. We'll see later what we can do about that. I'm saving the configuration. It means that the application is going to restart, but it's all seamless. And now the application should run without a glitch because it finds the connection string. Let's see if we can actually make it run on Azure. All right, so this is, the main page. Notice that you can also configure deployment slots if you want to have, for example, a staging slot for your website and a production slot. So this is also part of the whole app service plan. Let's go and click on the URL. It goes into a new page. It takes a moment to load because it's the first run. And here we go. We have our application running. We can try it out. It seems to be running just fine. But this time, oh goodness, it is running on azurewebsites.net. So we have managed to do the migration into Azure. Seems that the connection to the database is running just fine as well. So basically, we are ready to continue configuring our application and to take advantage of platform as a service. So platform as a service as a concept means that we are going to, as a cloud provider, manage the platform. We are offering you a platform. We manage, for example, we make sure that you always have the latest security patches in .NET, that you have, your IIS is always patched and to the latest, that the operating system you're using is patched and virus-free and secured, etc. But you also have different options. And so let's review those options and talk about other things that you could do if you want to migrate into the cloud. So this is always about responsibility, and we talk in Azure, and usually cloud providers talk about the shared responsibility model. What it means is that if you are running your application and your network and your hardware on-premise, you are responsible for literally everything, all right? If something goes wrong, it's up to you to change it. If a server breaks and fails, you need to replace it. If your network breaks, you need to fix it, all right? So you're responsible for everything. But of course, you also have a lot of control. On the other hand, if you go to IaaS, which is infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, then you have here less responsibility because Microsoft, the cloud provider, is going to take care of the servers, the hardware, of the storage, again, the hardware storage, the networking, as well as the virtualization system. But everything up from that, the operating system itself, etc., is going to be in your responsibility. So that's a lot of responsibility, and it's something that you need to consider, which is why a lot of people prefer to move to platform as a service, PaaS, where Microsoft, the cloud provider, is going to be responsible also of the operating system. So you can choose Windows or Linux, but after that we are going to keep you to the latest, we are going to patch it, we are going to secure it. It's also responsible for the middleware. For example, on Windows it would be IIS, or maybe you have another server on Linux. It's also responsible for the runtime. In our case it's .NET, it could be Node.js, etc., etc. And then you are really concentrating your effort on applications and data, which is really where your expertise is needed. Now there is another possibility to run things on Azure or on Microsoft. It's SaaS, Software as a Service. For example, think about Office 365, right? You can have Microsoft Word running in the web browser, or Microsoft PowerPoint, or maybe Excel. And basically we are here in charge of the application itself, in charge of the data, or at least the storing of the data and all that. You're still responsible to feed content into Word and PowerPoint and Excel, of course, but this is also another solution. Now, SaaS is typically what we call Office 365, Microsoft 365. But let's concentrate here on Azure with IaaS and PaaS. And here we decided to go with app services. It's really a pretty good choice, I would say, because it's going to give us quite a lot of benefits. So let's talk about that. First of all, you're going to have a very high productivity for your application. Things like choosing the frameworks that you want to run it on, right? .NET, Node.js, Java, Docker, PHP, Ruby, Python. And I mentioned Docker. Yes, it's true. You can deploy containers directly to app service. And this is a very neat way to run containers on Windows and on Linux, if it's a web application, specialized containers, without having to configure AKS, which would be more powerful but also more complicated to manage. All right? So it's good to know that you can deploy containers directly to app service. Staging and deployment, I already mentioned that very quickly earlier on. You have deployment slots. So you can create a new slot for staging, and then you can, for example, set up an Azure DevOps continuous integration, continuous deployment pipeline, which says, all right, I'm going to deploy to staging, and then I'm going to have a gated deployment to production so that somebody can test the staging and then can approve if yes or no we are going to go into production with that. Testing in production, now I know how scary that sounds, but again, we have tools for that. We have something, for example, called the snapshot debugger, and I'm going to talk more about that in the 5th session of this learning path. So if you want to know how to test in production in a very secure environment and very peace of mind, then you should join us in the 5th module at the end of this learning path. App Gallery Marketplace, let's say that you want to run WordPress on app service, no problem, we have you covered. You go to the App Gallery and then you say, I want to run WordPress. It's going to create everything for you, install it, and then you just have to manage your CMS. We have, of course, a lot more applications than that. It is managed, so you're going to be able to do autoscale. We'll see a demo about that later. But also things like load balancing, if you want to have multiple regions for your website, and multiple servers, and then we have a load balancer for you, for example, Azure Front Door. We'll talk about that in the 4th session of this learning path. It has high availability. We patch automatically if there are some security issues, etc. Cost, all right, we talked about the cost management. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. And backup and recovery, which is always good for peace of mind. It's also enterprise ready. Okay, your data can be global. We have 60 plus regions that you can go to. Hybrid support, definitely we know that most of the solutions that our customers are using are hybrid in a way, where maybe you have some data on premise, some in the cloud, maybe the application in the cloud and the SQL Server on premise. Azure Active Directory, all right, this is very important to secure your application and to have something like role-based access control for your app. This is super easy to do with Azure Active Directory and also extremely powerful for everything you have on Azure. And finally, of course, security and compliance. So let's talk about deployment options, because you really have a number of ways to bring your application into the cloud. And so here we have started by doing a migration, meaning that the app service migration assistant went to take the code, moved it as is into Azure and ran it. But of course, later you want to have some kind of continuous deployment option where you can continue to work on your application, modify it where necessary, and then have a continuous deployment. And this is exactly what right-click publish is not. All right, so don't get confused. Right-click publish is a feature that you have in Visual Studio. My DevOps friends are very much against it. It's not managed, all right? But it is sometimes convenient, and let's face it, as a developer, I think everybody did a right-click deploy, right-click publish at some point. So you can literally deploy from Visual Studio to Azure. Major issues with that is that it's not actually going to scale, all right? If you want to deploy multiple times during the day, it's going to be a little bit troublesome. Also, it's not automated, so it's more difficult to reproduce exactly how it is running. All right, so that's the main issue that you have here. So you have other options, deployment center. Deployment center is in the portal. If you go to your app service and then you go to the management, all right, you can set up a deployment center, and then you can deploy code from Azure repos and from GitHub repos, so that every time you, for example, push to master or to main, then it's going to actually deploy to Azure. But you also have other solutions, like for example, deploying for OneDrive, from OneDrive or from Dropbox or even from FTP. All right, so this is also a place to go. I would say it's not quite continuous integration, continuous deployment yet, because you don't have really a lot of control over what's happening, but it is a possibility to do. Another thing, of course, is GitHub Actions. All right, you develop some actions in YAML. You also have a lot of templates, etc., and then they will run automatically when you do certain actions in GitHub. For example, pushing. And of course, Azure DevOps, which allows you to do full pipelines. You can create different releases of your application. You can also have something which is really, really convenient and practical, gated deployment, meaning that you can deploy to a slot, to your staging slot, and then after that you say, I want an email to be sent to a responsible person, and this responsible person can check it out and say, yes, I approve that this goes to production, or no, I want to reject that for some reasons. So Azure DevOps is really very versatile. We have boards, repos, we have artifacts, test plan, we have those pipelines. Pipelines are really cool. It's a way using a UI to define how you want to deploy your application. And you can deploy to really any solution, for example, on-premise, but also any cloud, or even Linux, Mac, and Windows solutions. So that's really cool. You can have your stage environment releases, like I mentioned, deployment approvals, and we even have support for containers and Kubernetes. Now, I'm not going to go deeper into DevOps in this session, because that's really the topic of other learning paths, but it's good to know that this exists. Let's talk about insights. Insights is about monitoring your application. And in the 5th session, we'll go really deep into Insight. We'll go deep into Azure Monitor. But in here, I already want to mention it so that you understand what it is for. If you have, for example, something where you have a web page and then you have web services, everything can be monitored. It's going to flow into a common pot. And then Insights is going to help you make sense of this data. For example, you can create alerts. If the website goes down, you can create an alert that you get through, push notifications, or that you get through SMS or email, etc. And we'll see a demo about that in the 5th session of this module. Power BI, so that you can create really powerful visualization of your usage, of your users. Where are they from? What are they doing? How much time are they spending on which page, etc. And then you can also export that if you have a third-party tool, and then you want to visualize that in a third-party tool. So Application Insight, we'll see quickly in the demo how you can configure it. And then in the 5th session, like I say, we go much deeper. I mentioned Key Vault already in the introduction. It's important to understand that secrets always leak, right? So you want to have as few people responsible for secrets as possible, because as soon as you tell something to someone, the risk increases by a big factor. And we know that on GitHub you have tons, for example, of SSH keys, which are on GitHub, and they shouldn't be there because it's a secret. You don't want your organization's secret to end up on a public GitHub repository, okay? That leads to being really not very happy, as you can see here. So this is why we have Key Vault as a service. So this is a service which runs next to your applications, all right, next to your data. It's going to help you manage secrets, for example, SQL connection strings, but also username and passwords, storage account keys, and even things like certificates, TLS, SSL, encryption keys, if you want to encrypt and decrypt your data. And this is a central location with a central management team, somebody that you really trust, and these secrets can be then used by multiple applications. So you can have, for example, the connection string in one location, but you can have 2, 3, 4 web applications using it. you can have a totally different person managing and monitoring the secret. So again, it's role-based access control, okay? And then you can have your developers accessing the secret from their application, but without ever seeing or managing the secret. So it's very, very convenient. And I want to show you in the demo how you can do that. So in this demo, we are going to configure the application for monitoring. Then we are going to move the connection string to Key Vault, and then I'll show you how you can scale up and scale out, as well as, of course, scale down and in again when you are done with the demand. So we are back in the Azure portal, okay? And again, pretty much everything I do in the Azure portal, you can always do with the Azure CLI, the command line interaction. We can do it in Bash, in PowerShell, with scripts if you have a preferred scripting environment. Some operations can even be done directly from Visual Studio Code or from Visual Studio, etc., etc. But here we are in the portal, and so I'm going to show you here a little bit more about this app service. But first of all, let's go into application insights, and as you can see, it's not turned on right now. All right, I didn't specify that it should be turned on by default, so we are going to turn it on right now, and from this moment we are going to start recording data. Now this is really very powerful, and notice that I didn't need to change anything in my code, all right, and I'm already going to start collecting data, things like, you know, performance information, snapshot debugger, we'll talk more about that in the last session, it's about debugging in production, SQL commands. And if you are running your website with Node.js or with Java, for example, then we also have an SDK, and in .NET as well, you can use the SDK to add custom events to your application. For example, if you want to have some special information logged, etc., or maybe some performance information. All right, so we are creating the application insights instance. When it is done, we will go to check the data, but of course at this time we don't have any data. We literally just turned on the collection. But good to know that on application insight in the dashboard you have some graphs. You can pin those graphs to your own Azure dashboard if you want to have a good view. All right, you can also see all kinds of things like performance, critical issues, etc. We'll talk more about that in the last session of this learning path. For now, I want to move the connection string. This is really bothering me that literally everyone who has access to the app service portal here can see the connection string. Not the users, of course, this is secure, but all the developers. And so I want to move that to Key Vault, and to do that, I'm going to start by giving an identity to my application. I'm going to basically allow the application to impersonate a user, to say, all right, I am a user with rights and I have access to certain services. As you see, this is very easy to do. It's actually managed by Azure Active Directory. So like this, now we have what we call a security principle that was created in Azure AD. And now we will go to the resource group and we're going to create the Key Vault. And then we will configure it so that my app service can have access to the Key Vault. So let's go to the marketplace. Just like before, I will have to enter some information for the Key Vault, things like, you know, the subscription in which it's going to be billed, as a resource group, I'm going to use the same group, the name, of course. Then you want the region. For latency reasons, you want the Key Vault to be as close from your app service as possible, so I'm putting it in Western Europe. Pricing tier for us, standard is absolutely okay. If you choose premium, you have additional options. And the backup options are fine for me, so I'm going to review and create that. Creating the Key Vault creates a new service in Azure, but this service, the cool thing is that you can use it from multiple applications. And one thing which is nice is that you have an SDK. So if you want to do some fine-grained operations with code on your Key Vault, you can do that, but you can also access it in a way easier manner from App Service. I'm going to show you that in a second. So now I configure the access policy, meaning that I'm going to allow my app service to access the secret. And as you can see, you have a very fine-grained control. I'm just going to select here the get permission on secrets only. I need to select the principal. That's my app service. This is the GUID that I copied before. This is the app service that I want to give access to my secrets. All right. Let's go and add this access policy. This is done, and now I'm going to be able to, first of all, check that everything is fine. I have get access to secret. That's good. I can manage that here. The other thing I want to do is create a secret. So I'm going to create here a new one. I'm going to do a manual upload. Let's call it connection string. The value is the value of the connection strings that I'm taking from my app settings. And notice that one thing which is convenient, you can also set an activation date and an expiration date for your secrets, and you can even manually turn them off. For example, if you have some security concern, at any time you can go and turn the secret off, and then after that deal with the security problem. All right, let's go and validate that. Seems to be running just fine. We have a version, everything is version in Key Vault, so you always keep track of the changes. Let's go and identify the secret. So we are going to take a URI which is uniquely identifying this secret. And now I can go back into my configuration of my app service. The app service should have access to the Key Vault now. We are going to verify that it works. Let's go to the configuration. This is the connection string that we want to change. We are going to remove this connection string in clear text. And now we use the syntax at microsoft.keyvault, and we paste the URI, which is a unique identifier for the secret that we want. So this is really convenient. You don't need to save, to modify your code. You don't need to use an SDK or anything. You can do that directly from here. After saving, if we go down, we see that the Key Vault reference has been parsed properly. There is a small green hack there which tells me that everything's good. If there was a syntax error or an access policy problem, then you would see a red cross, and you will see some details here in the setting details where it would tell you what is wrong. Most probably it's a problem with the managed identities that you didn't set properly, for example, but basically you will get some guidance here. All right, so now we have secured our configuration string, our connection string. That's really cool. I can go and refresh the website, and we will see that it is running just like before. And so basically we are ready to move to the next stage. And so for this next demo, what I would like to show you now is how you can do a scale up and a scale down. So this is, again, the web application that we have, all right, and this is the app service in the Azure portal. And here we have different things that we can do. If you want more power for your application because you see that it is struggling, or maybe you need more capacity or more bandwidth or more compute power, this is where you can do it. And we call this scale up. At any time you can scale up and down, all right? So it's also important to know that you can scale down. For example, here, the app service plan I have cost around $150 per month, which is estimated. But if I see that I'm underutilizing that, maybe I want to go to the S1 instead, which is half price. Okay, so at any time you can do that. Now scaling out is another matter altogether. It's about adding more servers, more instances of the same web server to your application and then replicating the application on it. You can do that in a manual manner. Here you can change the number of instances, but even better, you can do this automatically using a custom autoscale, which is based on metrics. So here is how you configure that. We are going to go and add a rule, all right? Here I said that I want a maximum of 2 servers, so you have control over your cost. Of course, you could say I want 10 servers maximum. And I'm going to observe the CPU percentage as a metric, but of course you can also observe other things, for example, data in, data out, to see if you have a lot of requests. Now for this demo, I'm going to do something you shouldn't do in production. I'm going to set the threshold to 30%. Normally, you want to set it at around 70%. You want to scale out only when it's really necessary. Here, it's really for the demo. I will say, if I go over 30% for more than 1 minute, I want to add a server. And notice I said minimum 1 server, maximum 2 servers only. All right. So let's go now to Application Insight, because I want to show you that you have a way to monitor that, to monitor the scaling. And this is using something that we call the live metrics. Live metrics is really a live view of what's going on in your application. You can put that on a dashboard, on a big screen in your project room, for example. So right now we see that we don't have any requests. I'm going to actually create a request on my application. Done. And if I go back, well, you see the request. It's right here, okay? and I had just one request, a request rate of 1 per second. Now I'm going to turn on a tool which is simulating a lot of requests. You see that the tool, it's called artillery. It's actually sending requests at a rate of about 200 per second or more, which means that my CPU is going consistently over 50%. And as you can see, the scale-up rule works. Now I have 2 servers. Remember that I said I want a maximum of 2 servers. That's why I don't have more than those. But basically we see that the rule worked. And now I know that I can serve the demand and I won't have a denial of service at some point or whatever. All right, so this is the end already of this session, and I hope that you have learned a lot. What did we see in this session? First of all, we have seen how to move the application to app service using the app service migration assistant. All right, we did the assessment in the first session. Now we have actually moved the code and everything, and then we have configured the application telemetry, and of course we have turned on application insight, which is now collecting data. And later in the 5th session, we will see how we can make sense of this data and how you can really use Insight to refine the way that your application works. We have also added Key Vault as an additional service to our application, and then we moved one very important secret, the connection string, to Key Vault. Like this, we have role-based access control. It means that the developers don't see the connection string anymore. There is no risk that it gets mangled. But also, very importantly, if you need to modify the connection string, like we will see in the next demo, then basically you modify it once into Key Vault and then it's done. And then after that, we talked about scaling up and scaling out. We understood the difference between both, all right? Scaling up being choosing a more powerful app service plan, scaling down a less powerful service plan, so you save money. Scaling out, meaning you're going to have copies of your web server, and we saw how to do that in an automated manner. And of course, at any time, it's also going to scale in if the demand disappears, so you save money. Call to action, it's always time to learning. You should always keep learning. Go to aka.ms/mod20 and you will have links to tutorials, samples, Microsoft Learn module and more. Hopefully this session was useful for you. This was the 2nd session of this learning path. So this was module 2 of this learning path. In here we have seen the actual migration of the web application to app services. And in the next module we are going to talk about the data, because if you remember, now we have a hybrid solution with data on-premise, the web application in Azure. We are going to change that in the next module. So